Viewer discretion is advised. This story explores historical records and the moral questions they leave behind. The story begins not with victory, but with the sound of rusted metal hinges opening inside an old government archive. A historian moves through a narrow corridor lit only by a flickering bulb. Dust hangs in the air like ash from an unspoken past. On the shelf before him rests a sealed box marked 1947, classified. The label reads, "Prisoner Discipline Records. Do not circulate." His hands hesitate before breaking the wax seal. Inside are reports written in typewriter ink that has bled with time. The pages describe punishments that did not happen on battlefields or in enemy camps, but in hidden facilities run by their own armies. The historian's voice trembles as he reads a phrase repeated across multiple reports: corrective measures beyond conventional code. It is the kind of bureaucratic language that conceals something monstrous beneath its politeness. As he turns each fragile page, the narrative widens. These were not acts of spontaneous cruelty. They were organized, logged, and justified. The prisoners, some political, some military, all disappeared into an administrative silence so complete that their existence became a rumor. The historian pauses, aware that what lies in his hands is not just evidence, it is confession. If war is chaos, he whispers, then peace was control. He looks at the last sheet, where an officer's signature fades beneath a stamp of censorship. The ink forms the shape of a question mark. The camera lingers on that curve as the voiceover deepens. Some wars never end. They are simply buried under paper and time. A new document surfaces within the same archive, brittle and yellowed, titled Directive 12, Psychological Containment Protocol. No nation's insignia is visible, only a numerical code. The historian reads aloud, his voice echoing in the empty room. To ensure discipline and prevent ideological contamination, non-compliant detainees are to undergo isolation conditioning. Those words, sterile yet cold, unfold into meaning. Sources suggest the directive was issued near the end of the war, when panic and paranoia ruled more than strategy. Historians believe that isolation conditioning referred to long-term sensory deprivation tests designed to measure loyalty under duress. Officially, such operations never existed. Yet cross-reference records from other countries describe identical procedures under different names: adaptive correction, behavioral recalibration, mental endurance verification. It becomes clear that this was no isolated incident. It was a shared philosophy across multiple powers, the belief that fear could be engineered as precisely as ammunition. The historian adjusts his glasses and speaks as though addressing the past itself. How many of these protocols were destroyed? How many were simply renamed? His words dissolve into a hum of old electrical static as the camera pans over reels of film, unspooling by themselves in the dark. Frames show nothing but flickers of light and shadow, as if the images were erased deliberately. A faint stamp reads, "Return to Command Office. Classified." The narrator concludes quietly, "Even silence can have a signature." The echo of that sentence carries us to the next revelation. Maps can lie, not by what they show, but by what they omit. In this part, the historian overlays modern satellite imagery atop declassified wartime maps. Entire regions, once marked as logistical zones, appear blank today. Forests where roads should be. Lakes where records show barracks. Sources suggest these were vanishing camps, temporary sites erased both physically and administratively. No structures remain, only subtle geometric patterns in the earth, rectangles of soil too even to be natural. The camera glides above them, while the narration continues in a hushed, academic tone. According to regional archives, shipments of medical supplies and building materials were dispatched here between 1942 and 1944. Yet, no return manifests were ever filed. The implication is chilling, but presented with restraint. Historians believe these camps were constructed for testing resilience under controlled adversity. No graphic details exist, only inventory lists, pressure chambers, isolation units, rations measured to the gram. Each number, each entry, becomes its own kind of ghost. The historian recounts how, after the war, reconstruction teams were instructed to plow over these sites to restore environmental balance. In reality, it was an act of burial. The soil covers not just ruins, but responsibility. The scene closes with the historian standing before a wide plain under fog. He says quietly, "They called it reclamation. Perhaps it was erasure." The wind answers in a low whistle through the grass, carrying the weight of everything that history chose to forget. In a dimly lit interview room, the historian meets the last living clerk from a wartime logistics bureau. The man's hands tremble slightly as he adjusts his glasses, not from age, but from memory. For decades, he worked in silence, recording train schedules, storage inventories, and personnel transfers. Nothing seemed extraordinary until he noticed that some shipments never had return entries. When asked what those codes meant, his supervisor told him simply, "Do not ask questions that cannot be answered." The clerk recalls signing papers stamped with the words "restricted," physiological data. He never knew what they contained, only that they were collected daily from a site he was forbidden to visit. As the historian listens, the room seems to shrink. The man's eyes wander to the window, as though searching for something long gone. He speaks of nights when convoys left at dusk and returned empty, of reports rewritten before dawn, of names replaced with numbers. Yet when asked if he understood the nature of the work, he shakes his head slowly. "I was told obedience is safety," he whispers. The historian notes that the man's recollection aligns with newly uncovered archives describing internal data exchanges between military medicine units. These documents, sanitized and coded, conceal the outline of something systematic. The witness signs his statement, his pen quivering. Before leaving, he says, "I never spoke because silence was the only thing they let me keep." The historian closes the recorder, realizing that in every suppressed story, there lies a survivor still trapped by loyalty. The light in the room flickers once, as though time itself hesitates to proceed. The next discovery emerges not from classified files, but from propaganda reels. Grainy film footage once shown in wartime cinemas depicts soldiers marching in perfect rhythm, smiling for the camera. Their uniforms shine, their loyalty unquestioned. Yet beneath these rehearsed images lies another narrative, one never intended for the public eye. The historian overlays the footage with recovered memos marked corrective programs, behavioral reinforcement. According to military linguists, such terms disguised punishment operations conducted within their own ranks. Historians believe these programs targeted prisoners and dissident soldiers alike, aiming to transform defiance into submission. The voiceover speaks calmly, dissecting every frame. In one sequence, a group of soldiers salutes before a structure partially hidden by smoke. The narrator pauses, noting that the building's architecture matches records of disciplinary barracks once located near a now-erased facility. It is not evidence of brutality, but of deliberate concealment. Every smile, every salute becomes a performance masking fear. The historian explains that totalitarian regimes mastered the art of turning loyalty into theater. Uniforms were not mere clothing, but armor against suspicion. Behind those stitched insignias stood individuals trapped by their own obedience, afraid that hesitation itself could become treason. As the footage fades, the narrator's tone softens. They wanted orders so perfect, he says, that even conscience had to march in step. The final image lingers on a frozen frame. A salute halted midway, capturing the exact moment where discipline and doubt intersect. It is not violence we see, but the quiet terror of conformity. The historian returns to the archive where it all began. The files, once scattered, now form a coherent but disturbing picture. Across nations and ideologies, the same logic repeats. Punishment not as revenge, but as control, as experiment, as demonstration of authority. The narration slows, reflective and grave. If the battlefield ends at surrender, the voice asks, then what begins after? The camera moves through aisles of forgotten documents, each folder a fragment of suppressed truth. The historian notes that every regime, no matter its language or creed, found ways to justify suffering as necessity. Records describe programs designed to measure compliance through endurance. Others detail behavioral correction under observation. No single entry reveals the full story, but together they whisper the outline of an unseen machinery, one that did not stop with war's end. As he closes the final binder, the historian lingers on a page half burned, its edges blackened, but legible enough to read. The procedure continues under post-war directive. The air thickens with implication. He steps outside where rain begins to fall on the archive's stone steps. His voice returns, low and deliberate. Maybe punishment was not the failure of war. Maybe it was its continuation. The sound of rain merges with the turning of pages, as though history itself refuses to stay silent. The shot fades into darkness, leaving a single echoing question in the mind of the viewer. What price was paid for order, and who still bears it? The second phase of the investigation begins with a document that should never have survived. Its paper is brittle, its words typed unevenly by an exhausted machine, yet its meaning remains sharp. The title reads, Directive Concerning Punitive Conditioning Experiments. The historian's voice grows quieter as he reads, as if lowering his tone could lessen the gravity of what follows. It states that prisoners deemed non-compliant may undergo procedures designed to test their limits of obedience and endurance. Officially, such directives were erased after the war. But copies resurface from multiple nations, each with the same language structure and the same absence of human names. Historians believe this alignment across borders could not be coincidence. It implies an exchange of ideology, a shared method of control disguised as discipline. The narrator explains how these reports use the same phrases: behavioral recalibration, response assessment, psychological endurance. No nation admitted ownership, yet all benefited from the results. When the historian presents this to an ethics scholar, she closes her notebook slowly and says, "That is how cruelty survives. It changes its name." The narration continues, describing how these experiments were justified not by hatred, but by data. To measure suffering was to quantify loyalty. To push the limits of a person was to define the limits of power itself. The historian looks back at the directive's final line. Compliance ensures redemption. The words linger like an equation without solution. The voiceover fades with the sound of a ticking clock, a reminder that orders, once written, have no expiration date in the archives of history. Every war carries a belief system, and within that system lies the doctrine that makes anything possible. The historian uncovers a series of speeches delivered to officers in training schools during the late years of the conflict. They were instructed that discipline was not only a military virtue, but a moral one, and that breaking the will of a captive was proof of spiritual superiority. The text calls this belief the Iron Doctrine, a creed that elevated obedience into sanctity. Historians analyzing the transcripts describe it as a theology of control, where endurance equaled devotion and suffering equaled purification. Those who resisted were seen not as enemies, but as test subjects for ideological proof. The narrator's tone remains measured, almost scientific, yet the horror unfolds naturally. In one archived recording, a commanding officer tells his recruits, "To command is to reshape weakness into strength." The historian pauses the playback and reflects, but strength for whom? Sources suggest that this doctrine spread quietly among several military cultures, reinforced by fear of infiltration and collapse. The greater the paranoia, the harsher the discipline became. To preserve order, they believed, required breaking anything that might disobey it. In time, the doctrine no longer needed to be spoken aloud. It became instinct. The narrator observes that its legacy lingers even now, whenever authority disguises fear as loyalty. He concludes this section with a quiet assertion: ideology does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers in the language of procedure. The echo of that whisper follows him into the next archive. History often hides its worst acts behind gentle words. The historian spreads a collection of files across a wooden table, each filled with administrative jargon that sounds harmless until read closely. Phrases like disciplinary adaptation, controlled exposure, and adjustment through fatigue appear repeatedly across reports from different countries. None mention pain or punishment. Yet when cross-referenced with medical logs, these phrases coincide with periods of unexplained hospitalizations among detainees. The narrator explains that cruelty learned to speak bureaucratically. It wore the mask of efficiency, turning torment into paperwork. A linguist assisting the investigation remarks that language was the first defense mechanism of every regime. To rename suffering is to erase empathy. The historian reads one line aloud. Subject failed to maintain composure under extended evaluation. There is no description, only failure, as though humanity itself were an experiment that did not meet standards. He observes that the deeper one reads, the colder the tone becomes. Reports that once concerned people evolve into documents about systems, units, and numbers. The narrator steps back and reflects that dehumanization begins not in action, but in vocabulary. When cruelty adopts the grammar of order, it becomes invisible. He closes one file and opens another, where the same language appears decades later in unrelated conflicts. The continuity is undeniable. The voice lowers to a near whisper. The words changed nothing, but they changed how we looked away. The scene ends in silence, broken only by the rustle of pages that once turned suffering into structure. The historian enters a warehouse on the outskirts of a decommissioned airfield. Inside, the floor is scattered with rusted instruments and broken thermometers. What remains are fragments of a facility once described in files as a low-temperature endurance laboratory. Officially, it was meant for research into pilot survival under freezing conditions. Yet the dates and shipments do not match military records. According to reports, the site operated at night under sealed supervision. Historians believe it was part of the punitive conditioning program, designed to test the breaking point of the human body and mind without acknowledgement. The narrator's tone stays calm, factual, and almost reverent. He notes that no personal names appear in the recovered documents, only codes, durations, and temperatures. The word subject replaces person, and the phrase tolerated exposure replaces suffered cold. Within this language lies the detachment that allowed horror to exist without witness. A former technician, interviewed decades later, recalled only the sounds, the metallic click of a stopwatch, the hum of ventilation fans, and the silence between them. There was no screaming, he said, only breathing slowing down until it disappeared. The historian does not confirm or deny, merely cites sources, maintaining the careful distance of scholarship. He concludes that these chambers were not designed for survival, but for measurement, transforming endurance into a number that could be archived and forgotten. As the camera pans across frost patterns still visible on the walls, the narrator remarks softly, "Temperature was never the variable. It was morality." The air grows colder, as if history itself remembers. Beyond individual facilities, a larger system operated in secrecy. The historian uncovers correspondences between ministries and private institutes, referring to something called the Bureau of Silence. It was not a single office, but a network dedicated to controlling how information about disciplinary programs circulated. The Bureau's task was to erase traces before questions could arise. Memos show coordination between nations once considered enemies, suggesting a shared interest in keeping these operations obscured. The narrator observes that even in wartime rivalry, the language of secrecy transcended borders. Documents reveal that entire train convoys were redirected under the Bureau's authority, moving materials and personnel with no record of arrival. Historians believe these transfers concealed data and equipment used in the endurance programs. A surviving memo reads, "The integrity of our research depends on discretion." Another adds, "Reports must appear unremarkable to external auditors." The voiceover explains that this bureaucratic silence was not an accident, but an engineered feature of governance. By removing direct accountability, cruelty could continue indefinitely, protected by paperwork. The historian remarks that many of the same administrators went on to serve in post-war research divisions, their pasts buried under new titles. The Bureau dissolved officially in 1946. Yet its methods lived on in every government archive where truth becomes a file waiting for clearance. As the scene fades, the narrator states, "The greatest weapon of any regime is not the experiment itself, but the ability to erase the memory of it." The camera holds on a locked filing cabinet, the key missing, the silence absolute. In the final segment of this phase, the historian opens a box recently declassified by an international archive. Inside are photographs, their edges curled by humidity, their content carefully mundane. No bodies, no faces, only rooms. Metal tables, overhead lamps, tiled walls marked by condensation. Each image is labeled with a number and the same word repeated, facility. At first glance, they reveal nothing. Yet when the historian aligns them chronologically, a pattern emerges. Objects move subtly from frame to frame, suggesting a narrative intentionally fragmented. He notes that this technique of omission was itself a form of censorship. By removing the human element, the photographers created a record that hides its own subject. A camera used for documentation becomes a tool for forgetting. Historians studying these images describe them as visual metaphors for denial. The light is clinical, the composition detached, as if the photographer stood not in a place of suffering, but in a laboratory seeking control. One image, magnified under digital restoration, shows a reflection in a metal surface, an outline of a figure wearing an armband with no insignia. It is the only trace of a witness among hundreds of sterile shots. The narrator's voice slows as he concludes that these photographs were never meant for the public. They were for reports, for classification, for the quiet satisfaction of proof without consequence. The scene ends with the historian closing the box gently and whispering, "History does not forget what it cannot name." The sound of a camera shutter echoes once more before fading into stillness. The historian enters a reading room deep within a European archive, where light filters through narrow windows like diluted memory. Before him lies a bound collection titled Applied Human Adaptation Studies. It carries no author, only a date and a red seal of approval. The preface speaks not of warfare, but of progress, of advancing human capability through observation. Yet the deeper he reads, the clearer it becomes that progress here was built on suffering, disguised as science. The voice of the narrator is calm but heavy, explaining that the scientists who contributed to this work never used words like cruelty or victim. They wrote instead of parameters, reactions, and thresholds. Their goal, it claimed, was to redefine the limits of survival. What they never defined was morality. One report lists a series of endurance experiments conducted on unnamed participants who were described only as specimens of resilient constitution. The historian notes the absence of identity as the first symptom of ethical collapse. Another entry speaks of studying stress-induced clarity by exposing subjects to deprivation, claiming the results could improve pilot performance. Historians believe this language, so precise and academic, was the armor that allowed ordinary professionals to walk past conscience without seeing it. The narrator reflects that scientific neutrality, when detached from empathy, becomes a void where anything can happen and nothing is considered wrong. He closes the file, and for a moment the silence in the room feels accusatory, as if the air itself resents being complicit. The camera lingers on a line underlined in faded ink. Discovery requires sacrifice. The historian whispers, but who decided whose sacrifice it would be? In the next file lies a table of numbers too meticulous to be imagined. Rows of temperatures, heart rates, durations, and reactions. It is labeled performance data under controlled pressure. The historian describes it as one of the most chilling documents he has ever seen, precisely because it is so impersonal. Every column turns agony into arithmetic. Pain becomes a unit of measurement. Endurance becomes a graph. There are no margins for humanity, only statistical significance. The narrator explains that this obsession with quantification was not limited to one nation. Across the world during the war, the same ideology emerged. The belief that human limits could be standardized, tested, and improved like machinery. Researchers, driven by ambition or obedience, recorded how the body responded when stripped of comfort, when denied sleep, when deprived of warmth. They claimed the data would protect soldiers in extreme conditions, yet none of it was gathered with consent. Historians later confirmed that these records were quietly referenced in post-war research, embedded within academic publications without acknowledgement of their origin. The voiceover grows more somber as it reflects on how numbers can disguise moral voids. The historian says, "In these charts you will not find cruelty or guilt. You will find efficiency. Each line of data represents a life reduced to a decimal point." He traces his finger across one column labeled "Failure to Continue" and notes that even death had been converted into data. The scene closes with the historian stating softly, "When knowledge forgets compassion, it ceases to be knowledge at all." As the investigation deepens, the historian encounters the most enduring justification for all these acts: the myth of necessity. Every document, every testimony, every silence returns to this single argument: that it had to be done. Files recovered from multiple nations repeat the same phrase: essential for national survival. In one memorandum, a military physician defends his work by writing, "Without empirical evidence, our soldiers would perish in the field." We acted for humanity. Historians believe this reasoning was the moral currency of the era, trading empathy for efficiency. The narrator explains that the myth of necessity allows any cruelty to wear the mask of duty. It transforms conscience into calculation. The historian reviews minutes from a wartime ethics council, a body created not to question, but to formalize approval. Their discussions reveal no outrage, only logistics. How to minimize resources, how to optimize results. One member even suggests that extreme conditions might produce valuable discoveries for future peace. The narrator pauses, his tone tightening. It was never peace they sought, he says. It was validation. The myth persists because it flatters those in power. It tells them that harm is acceptable if it teaches something useful. Yet history shows that the lessons learned were not about endurance, but about how easily the idea of necessity erases the human core. The historian closes the final file and states quietly, "They claimed they did it for survival. What they ensured was remembrance." The last image fades on a torn document stamped "Approved," the ink still dark as if refusing to dry. The historian opens a new set of archives, this time not from one government, but from many. Each collection bears a different language, a different insignia, yet the same structure repeats itself. Instructions, data charts, and conclusions mirror each other so precisely that they could have been copied from a single template. What began as an inquiry into one regime's secrecy now reveals a shared philosophy across borders. The narrator's tone remains quiet, analytical, the cadence of someone unwrapping a truth too large to fit in one nation's guilt. Historians reviewing these documents point out the eerie symmetry. Reports on exposure, confinement, and psychological trials, all justified as preparation for future warfare. Each side believed the other was more ruthless and thus excused its own extremity. This, the narrator explains, is how morality becomes a mirror. When both reflections are distorted, each believes itself straight. In one comparison, he places two memos side by side, one written in English, the other in German, and reads their conclusions aloud. Both describe the endurance of subjects as proof of discipline. Both end with the phrase, applicable to future resilience training. The words differ only by translation. The historian concludes that this convergence was not accidental. It was the outcome of a century convinced that survival justifies imitation. The voice lowers as he observes that war does not divide civilization from barbarity. It only duplicates the same methods under new flags. As the scene fades, he closes both files and says, "When the mirror is cracked, both sides see the other's face and call it victory." The sound of turning pages echoes like overlapping reflections. Beneath the layers of secrecy lies another revelation: the participation of institutions that believe themselves untouched by war. The historian traces financial ledgers showing contracts between military departments and civilian laboratories. Pharmaceutical companies, universities, even private hospitals supplied equipment and expertise under the promise of research for defense. Yet the subjects of that research were never disclosed. Historians uncover correspondence between administrators where ethics are mentioned only in the context of cost. One memo reads, "Ensure efficiency while maintaining discretion." The narrator's tone grows colder. These were not sadists, but professionals, scientists who viewed themselves as detached from moral consequence. They operated under the illusion that neutrality absolved them. The historian reads a letter from a young chemist to his mentor. "I no longer recognize the boundary between science and service. We innovate in darkness and call it progress." The letter was never mailed, found decades later in an unmarked folder. The narrator reflects that war turns intellect into an accomplice, not through ideology, but through opportunity. Each discovery promised funding, prestige, the illusion of contribution to national security. When the war ended, these collaborators continued their work in peacetime industries, their findings sanitized, their origins unacknowledged. The historian points to a list of post-war patents derived from wartime data, inventions still used in medicine and engineering today. He does not accuse, he observes. The tragedy, he says softly, is not that knowledge survived. It is that conscience did not. The camera lingers on a laboratory door closing slowly, as if the century itself were refusing to answer. At the end of the third phase, the historian uncovers a single sheet of paper preserved in a private collection. It is handwritten, not typed, signed by two scientists whose names appear nowhere else in the official record. The letter is dated 1 week before the end of the war. Its first line reads, "We have gone too far to claim ignorance." The handwriting trembles, suggesting haste or remorse. The text confesses that the endurance experiments had exceeded their stated objectives and that data were being falsified to justify continuation. The scientists admit that what began as research had turned into obsession, a desire to reach the human limit simply because it existed. They write, "We have created a system that rewards cruelty with recognition." The narrator reads their words slowly, each syllable deliberate, like a verdict. Historians consider this letter unique because it breaks the chain of justification found in every other file. It does not defend, it admits. Yet even this confession is tainted with pride. The writers end by calling their work a necessary burden of progress. The historian folds the fragile paper back into its envelope and notes that it was labeled "Destroy" after reading. Somehow, it survived. Its existence proves that even within machinery built for denial, a flicker of guilt remained. The voice grows faint. Perhaps this letter was never meant for history. Perhaps it was written to remind the future that remorse too can be archived. The screen fades to black, leaving the faint sound of paper crackling like the last heartbeat of conscience. The scene opens in silence, broken only by the slow rhythm of footsteps over snow. The historian walks across a desolate field in Eastern Europe where a forgotten facility once stood. Beneath the frost lies nothing visible, yet something remains, an echo carried by the wind. He kneels beside a patch of ground where fragments of notebooks were found, their ink blurred into pale stains. These were diaries written by detainees during the final winter of the war. Most pages are unreadable, but a few words endure. Cold, hope, forgive. The historian reads them aloud softly, his breath forming clouds that vanish into the air. These are not testimonies of anger, but of endurance. The absence of detail makes them heavier. The narrator explains that historians often avoid sentiment, yet here emotion is the only surviving evidence. From these fragments they reconstruct the rhythm of life in captivity, waking before dawn, counting hours through the sound of distant machinery, watching frost form on the ceiling until it resembled stars. The voice grows reflective. Sometimes silence is the last form of resistance. Each line of the diary, though simple, reveals a consciousness refusing to disappear. One entry ends with the sentence, "If no one remembers us, the snow will." The historian closes the notebook, and the camera lingers on the white expanse surrounding him. Snowflakes fall on his coat as the voiceover continues. History is often written by survivors, but some survive only in memory. The wind carries that line across the frozen plain, turning personal sorrow into collective remembrance. Inside a dimly lit museum archive, the historian opens a collection of envelopes discovered in a post office that never resumed operation after the war. Each letter bears a name, a stamp, and an address that no longer exists. They were written by families to soldiers, prisoners, and missing civilians who would never read them. The curator explains that these letters were found stacked in boxes marked "Return to Sender," but were never returned. The historian reads one aloud. A mother writes to her son, "They told me you are being cared for. I dream you are warm." Her handwriting trembles across the page. Another letter, from a wife to her husband, reads, "I heard the war may end soon. Will you come home before the spring?" None of these letters were opened until decades later, and now they exist as frozen conversations, messages sent into silence. The narrator's tone becomes tender but restrained. He notes that these words reveal more truth than official records ever could. They show how families tried to believe in mercy when history had none to offer. The historian reflects that the most tragic part of war is not death itself, but the suspension of love, the unanswered gesture. As the letters are placed back into storage, he says, "They are evidence not of what was done, but of what was hoped for." The scene fades with the sound of paper rustling, like whispers of ghosts speaking a language that only longing can translate. The historian's final line before the transition is almost a prayer. Every war leaves behind a mailroom of dreams that never reach their destination. The historian meets a woman who has spent her entire career restoring damaged documents from the war. Her hands are steady, her voice even, but her eyes reveal exhaustion. Surrounded by stacks of fragile paper, she admits that the task has changed her. At first, she viewed the work as preservation, saving information from decay. But over time, each restored page began to feel like a resurrection of suffering. "I stopped counting how many files I cleaned," she says. Each one felt like opening a wound. The historian listens silently as she describes the moment she realized that neutrality was impossible. "You cannot touch these papers and remain untouched," she confides. Some nights she dreams of the people behind the handwriting, though she has never seen their faces. The narrator's tone becomes meditative. He explains that history often demands objectivity, yet true understanding requires empathy. The archivist shows him a photograph she found tucked between two reports, a faded portrait of a young man smiling faintly. No name, no date. She keeps it on her desk as a reminder that every statistic once had a pulse. "When I finish a file," she says, "I whisper their names, even if I have to invent them." The historian remarks that her confession bridges the gap between scholar and witness. In the quiet of the archive, their voices fade beneath the hum of fluorescent light. The narrator concludes, "Perhaps the duty of remembrance is not to restore truth, but to restore feeling." The sound of turning pages merges with the rhythm of breathing, indistinguishable from prayer. The historian enters a grand hall that once served as a wartime academy. Dust covers its marble floor, and faint inscriptions in Latin still line the walls. They translate to words of virtue, discipline, honor, progress. Yet the deeper he explores, the more he feels these words were used not as ideals, but as instruments. In this place, knowledge was worshipped like a god, and obedience was its ritual. The historian reads from a lecture transcript preserved in the archives. It proclaims that suffering purifies the spirit and strengthens the collective. The professor who delivered it was a renowned scientist, celebrated for his intellect, yet history records that his lessons later justified human experiments disguised as spiritual trials. The narrator's tone is calm, almost reverent, because the horror lies not in blood, but in belief. He explains that during those years, science crossed into theology. Equations replaced commandments. Researchers spoke of salvation through endurance, of redemption through data. Faith was no longer in heaven, but in the laboratory. The historian examines a set of journals where scientists wrote prayers before their experiments, asking for strength to continue their duty. They believed they were serving something greater than themselves. A perfect world purified by knowledge. That, the narrator reflects, is how cruelty learns to sanctify itself. As he walks through the echoing corridor, light filters through broken windows, casting shadows shaped like crosses on the walls. He whispers, "When science became faith, morality became myth." The sound of distant bells fades beneath the closing of heavy doors, like a church built for reason and lost to silence. The historian stands before an enormous wall of charts and reports, each filled with graphs drawn in precise black ink. Every line represents a calculation, every dot a human life reduced to measurement. He runs his hand across the papers and feels the weight of decades pressing down. These are the results of thousands of tests conducted under the justification of progress. Historians describe this collection as the coldest monument ever built, one made not of stone, but of paper. The narrator's voice softens as he observes that numbers, when separated from compassion, become tools of erasure. In these graphs, human pain is represented as performance, and death is recorded as an anomaly. One document lists subject terminated at stage 7 without explanation or emotion. Another records remarkable resistance under prolonged exposure. The historian notes that even praise becomes cruelty when the subject of admiration cannot speak. He explains that this obsession with documentation was not accidental. It was a method of control. If something is written, it becomes real, and if it is quantified, it becomes justified. He reflects that data, once collected, acquires permanence that memory does not. It survives beyond guilt. Looking at the endless columns, the historian whispers, "This is what the war left behind. Not ruins, but records." The camera pans slowly across the wall, where charts blur into faces imagined by the viewer. "We used to think numbers told the truth," he says. But truth without empathy is only calculation. The scene closes with the rustle of papers echoing like the shifting of bones beneath the floor. The historian recounts the final days of the war when retreating forces destroyed their archives. Witnesses describe columns of smoke rising from courtyards as files burned by the ton. The air was thick with ash that looked like falling snow. The narrator's voice becomes distant, as if speaking through the smoke itself. "They did not burn knowledge," he says. "They burned accountability." Historians estimate that more than half of the records concerning punishment and endurance programs vanished in those fires. Yet fragments survived. Pages carried by the wind, charred edges fused into unreadable masses. The historian retrieves one such fragment preserved in glass. On it, only a few words remain. "Procedure suspended due to moral concern." That single sentence, half erased, becomes the only evidence of conscience within a system built on denial. The narrator explains that the destruction of documents was not an act of fear, but of continuation. By erasing evidence, they ensured the story could be rewritten. History, he reflects, is not only what we remember, but what we are allowed to remember. The fire becomes both literal and symbolic, a purging of guilt disguised as necessity. As the flames die in the historian's imagination, the camera moves over the blackened ground where paper and soil have become one. He picks up a handful of ash and lets it fall through his fingers, whispering, "Even when you burn the truth, its smoke remains." The wind carries the last embers into a gray sky as the music fades, leaving only the faint crackle of memory refusing to die. The historian stands on the edge of a barren field. where the sky hangs low and gray. It has been decades since the war ended, yet the Earth still exhales its secrets. Environmental researchers recently discovered traces of chemicals buried deep beneath the soil, residues from the same compounds once used in experimental endurance tests. The narrator's voice is calm but grave, explaining that history does not vanish with the people who wrote it. It seeps into the ground, lingers in air and memory. The scientist assisting him gestures toward a sample jar filled with dust the color of ash. She says softly, "It's as if the land remembers." The historian nods, aware that the soil beneath his boots has absorbed not just chemical elements, but moral ones. The lingering contamination of denial. He reflects that the true aftermath of war is not always visible. It can exist as data in laboratory reports or as toxins hidden in the earth. Historians call this phenomenon the persistence of consequence, the way deeds outlive their justifications. The narrator continues, describing how local villagers once avoided this area, claiming the air carried a strange heaviness. Scientists later confirmed the presence of microfibers, fragments of burned archives scattered by the wind. The historian lifts a handful of dirt and lets it slip through his fingers. The past, he says, is not gone. It is diffused. The wind rises, carrying faint traces of smoke from the long-extinguished fires. As the camera pulls back, the voiceover adds, "History leaves its fingerprints on everything it touches, even the air we breathe." The field remains silent, yet the silence itself feels haunted, a whisper of unfinished confession. Inside a conference hall illuminated by sterile white light, the historian attends a modern symposium on bioethics. Experts debate artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and the moral limits of scientific pursuit. Their language is polished, their tone detached, but beneath it runs a familiar current. Each speaker insists that their innovations are controlled, that regulations protect humanity from excess. The historian listens, remembering the documents he studied. The same assurances, the same logic, repeated in another century. He notes in his journal that every generation believes it has transcended the mistakes of the past while quietly replicating them in new forms. The narrator explains that the echoes of wartime reasoning now appear in discussions about data privacy, human experimentation, and algorithmic control. The context has changed, but the core question remains. How much of humanity can we sacrifice in the name of progress? A professor presents a slide comparing neural mapping projects to early endurance research, arguing that the difference lies only in intention. The room falls silent for a moment. The historian observes that silence as the most honest response. He writes, "Knowledge without restraint becomes faith without morality." As the session ends, the crowd disperses, leaving behind the faint hum of machines recording every word. The narrator's voice softens. The future, he says, is not haunted by ghosts. It is haunted by patterns. The historian closes his notebook, realizing that the study of ethics is not about condemning the past, but about recognizing its reflections in the present. The camera fades to black as the murmur of discussion dissolves into the mechanical hum of progress continuing unchallenged. The historian travels to a quiet coastal town where a museum dedicated to wartime research was scheduled to open years ago. Its doors remain locked. The glass display case is still wrapped in protective plastic. The local curator greets him with a hesitant smile and explains that funding was withdrawn after protests. Families of former officials argued that the exhibition would reignite blame, while others feared it would invite denial. The building stands as a monument to indecision, a place meant to preserve truth now frozen in bureaucratic limbo. The narrator's tone turns reflective. Perhaps, he says, the world prefers discomfort in fragments rather than clarity in full. Inside, dust gathers on unopened crates labeled recovered instruments, photographic evidence, letters. The historian peers through the glass of a display case and sees a single object already placed. A stopwatch, stopped forever at 2:17. Beneath it lies a placard reading, "Time of final record unknown." He realizes that the museum's closure is itself part of the story. A continuation of silence disguised as caution. The curator admits that she sometimes unlocks the door at night and walks through the exhibits alone, not as a guide but as a guardian. "It feels like they are waiting for permission to be seen," she says. The historian replies quietly, "Maybe history does not need permission, only courage." As they leave, the setting sun reflects off the locked glass doors, casting long shadows across the floor. The narrator concludes, "A closed museum is still a confession. It tells us we are not ready to face what we already know." The wind outside rattles the signboard that reads, "Opening soon," a promise suspended in eternity. The historian sits alone in his study, surrounded by the remnants of everything he has found. Folders, letters, reels of film that no longer play. The desk lamp casts a narrow circle of light, and beyond it stretches a darkness filled with silence and thought. His voice, low and deliberate, admits that the more he uncovers, the heavier the story becomes. At first, he believed history was a matter of evidence and interpretation. But now, after months spent reading words written by those who believed cruelty was duty, he realizes history is also inheritance. The sins recorded on paper have shape and weight. They do not vanish, they transfer. The historian writes in his journal, "To study darkness is to carry a part of it." He explains that each generation inherits not only the victories of the past, but also its unfinished remorse. His tone remains calm but weary as he reflects that scholars are often praised for objectivity, yet true understanding demands vulnerability. He recalls the archivist's confession, the letters never sent, the frozen diaries. They have followed him into his dreams, where faces he never saw seem to ask questions he cannot answer. "Why did you look?" they whisper. "And what will you do with what you found?" The historian has no answer. Instead, he closes his notebook, aware that documentation is only one half of remembrance. The other half is empathy. As the lamp flickers, he whispers, "History is not past. It is a weight that chooses who will lift it next." The sound of pages turning fades into the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, merging with the ticking of a clock that no longer marks time, but conscience. Among the many boxes left unopened, one remains sealed at the center of the archive. It bears no classification number, only the words, "restricted," "indefinite." The historian hesitates before opening it, as though he already knows what lies inside. When he finally lifts the lid, he finds a single folder containing fragments of an official report. Most pages are blank, but one remains intact. It details an operation so vast, it seems impossible. Yet every line is written in the same bureaucratic tone found in all the others. The narrator reads it quietly. Continuation authorized under post-war directives. Objective: transfer of applicable methods to Allied research divisions. The historian pauses, realizing that the story does not end with surrender. It merely changes its name. The same structures, the same logic, persist under new institutions. He whispers, "It was never buried. It was absorbed." Historians later confirm that parts of wartime research resurfaced in post-war scientific publications, stripped of origin, accepted as innovation. The voice grows somber. Progress does not erase guilt, he says. It only refines it. The historian closes the folder and marks it with a single word in his notebook: cycle. As the light in the room dims, the camera lingers on his reflection in the glass cabinet door. His face overlaps with the shadows of old documents, as if he too has become part of the archive. The voiceover concludes softly. The final record is never the last. It waits for someone else to reopen it, to remember, and to decide what silence is worth. The faint sound of the cabinet locking echoes like a closing chapter that refuses to stay closed. Night falls over the archive. Only the sound of distant rain remains. The historian stands by the window, looking at the city below. Lights glowing through mist like stars trapped in fog. He begins to speak, not as a scholar, but as a witness transformed by his own pursuit. We call it the past, he says, but the past breathes through us. He recalls every phase of his journey: the forgotten prisoners, the hidden commands, the endurance experiments, the voices that still whisper between pages. Each was a fragment of one truth: that punishment was never the real crime. The true crime was forgetting. The historian's tone deepens, carrying both fatigue and resolve. If knowledge is power, then remembrance is resistance. He explains that silence is not always peace. Sometimes it is complicity wearing the mask of calm. He turns off the lamp, leaving only the faint light of dawn beginning to rise beyond the rain. History, he continues, does not forgive silence. It waits for those who dare to listen. The narrator's voice softens into a near whisper as the scene widens to show the empty corridors of the archive. Each shelf, each locked cabinet, becomes a monument to what remains untold. We do not study the past to mourn it, he says. We study it to recognize ourselves within it. As the final image fades, the historian places one last note inside a folder labeled "To be continued." The closing line echoes through the silence. Perhaps remembrance is the only justice time can still afford. The sound of turning pages returns once more before dissolving into a long, deliberate silence that feels like understanding. If you believe history should never stay buried, share this story and tell us which hidden truth the world still refuses to face.